Look who just got exposed, but not in the way they expected. Not you, them. You felt it, didn't you? That subtle shift in the air, that quiet recalibration in the room when people started realizing the story they told about you doesn't quite line up with the reality unfolding in front of them. They thought you were finished. They thought you were overwhelmed. They thought you collapsed under pressure. They labeled you fragile. They labeled you lost. They labeled you as someone who couldn't handle it. And they spoke about you with that tone, that quiet certainty people use when they think the chapter is closed. But here's what they missed. You weren't falling apart. You were falling inward. While they were narrating your downfall, you were dismantling your old identity piece by piece. Not in panic, not in chaos, but in silence. Strategic silence. The kind that doesn't need to defend itself because it knows time will do the explaining. They mistook your absence for shame. They mistook your quiet for defeat. They mistook your withdrawal for weakness. And you let them. You didn't rush to correct the record. You didn't publish clarifications. You didn't argue your case in the court of public opinion. You stepped back, you watched. You observed who spoke too quickly, who celebrated too early, who built confidence on your supposed collapse. And you took notes, not out of bitterness, but out of awareness. Because when someone thinks you're powerless, they reveal everything. They reveal how they treat those they think can't defend themselves. They reveal how quickly they build narratives to protect their own ego. They reveal whether their compassion was conditional all along. You learned more in silence than you ever could have learned in confrontation. They were busy telling the story. You were busy studying the storytellers. And here's the part that unsettles them now. You didn't break, you recalibrated, you didn't disappear, you redirected. While they replayed the same assumptions over and over. You were rebuilding foundations they didn't even know existed. You were refining your thinking. You were sharpening your discernment. You were strengthening parts of yourself that once sought approval from rooms that never intended to give it. They thought your silence was surrender. It was reconnaissance, not of them, but of yourself. You were mapping your patterns, examining your blind spots, understanding your triggers, learning how you once gave your energy too freely. They assumed you were overwhelmed by pressure. In reality, you were developing pressure tolerance. They assumed you were humiliated. In truth, you were detaching from the need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. And here's where the exposure begins. Not because you stood on a stage and revealed anything, but because your results started speaking. Slowly at first, subtly, a shift in your posture, a change in your tone, a different way of responding or not responding. They expected you to resurface defensive. You resurfaced composed. They expected bitterness. You offered neutrality. They expected you to explain yourself. You simply continued moving forward. And that's when confusion set in. Because the narrative they built required you to stay small. It required you to remain in the role they assigned you. But you stepped out of character, and not dramatically quietly. You stopped participating in conversations that diminished you. You stopped correcting assumptions that didn't deserve your energy. You stopped trying to convince people of your worth. And when someone no longer needs validation, something strange happens. The ones who relied on that need start feeling unstable. They ask themselves questions they don't like the answers to. Did we misread them? Were we wrong? Why don't they seem affected? Not because you attacked anyone, but because you didn't. You didn't fight back. You didn't escalate. You didn't perform outrage. You let time stretch. And time is uncomfortable for people who spoke too soon. You see, when someone underestimates you, they reveal their own frame of reference. They reveal the limits of their imagination. They reveal what they believe is possible and what they don't. They saw you step back and assumed retreat. They didn't consider recalibration. They saw you go quiet and assumed collapse. They didn't consider consolidation. They saw you stop explaining and assumed defeat. They didn't consider discipline. And now they're revisiting those moments, replaying your silence with new understanding. That message you didn't respond to, that argument you didn't engage in, that rumor you didn't address. It wasn't weakness, it was choice. You chose not to spend energy defending yourself to people who already decided who you were. You chose not to perform competence for an audience that was invested in your failure. You chose not to interrupt people while they revealed themselves. That's not manipulation. That's maturity. You didn't set traps. You set boundaries. You didn't orchestrate downfall. You allowed assumptions to run their course. And here's the quiet truth. They're wrestling with now. You were never trying to win against them. You were trying to win against your former self, the version that would have over-explained, over-apologized, overextended. That version is gone, replaced by someone who understands that clarity doesn't argue. It acts, it builds, it moves. While they were narrating your ending, you were writing a different genre entirely. They built their confidence on your presumed defeat. And now that foundation feels unstable. Not because you shook it, because reality did. You didn't expose them publicly. You exposed the illusion privately, by outgrowing it. The illusion that you needed their validation, the illusion that you required their agreement, the illusion that their narrative defined your trajectory. And when someone realizes they were confidently wrong, there's a discomfort that sets in, not humiliation. Awareness, not punishment, reflection. They start noticing how quickly they spoke, how certain they were, how invested they became in a story that lacked evidence. And you're not gloating, you're not announcing, you're not reminding anyone of what they said. You're simply continuing. And that continuation is louder than any speech. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Your absence wasn't retreat. It was refinement. Your stillness wasn't defeat. It was discipline. You didn't trick anyone. You let them reveal themselves. You didn't destroy narratives. You let them collapse under their own exaggeration. You didn't seek revenge, you sought alignment. And now, as the illusion dissolves and the roles begin to shift, you remain exactly where you were meant to be. Not on a stage demanding recognition, but in motion, steady, grounded, recalibrated. They're just now realizing the story wasn't over, and you're just getting started. And now that the dust has settled, now that the noise has faded, now that the early applause for your downfall echoes awkwardly in empty rooms, they're sitting with something unfamiliar: silence. The same silence they once used to describe you. Only this time it's theirs. Because when the excitement of assumption wears off, when the thrill of gossip cools down, when the emotional high of feeling superior dissolves, what's left is reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable for people who spoke with certainty. You didn't rush to clear your name. You didn't storm back into the room demanding recognition. You didn't make a dramatic return with fireworks and speeches. You just kept building quietly, consistently, methodically. And consistency is terrifying to people who assumed your setback was permanent. They expected a flare-up. They expected you to defend yourself. They expected emotional reactions. Instead, they got composure. You became steady. And steadiness is hard to argue with, because drama can be dismissed. Emotion can be minimized. But sustained progress, that forces recalculation. They're recalculating now, revisiting the timeline, replaying the moments when they decided you were done. It's subtle at first, a small crack in confidence. Then it grows, because the narrative required you to stay in a particular place. It required stagnation. It required visible struggle. It required proof that their judgment was correct. But you didn't stay frozen in the role they assigned you. You evolved. And evolution doesn't ask permission from spectators. They're starting to understand something that shifts the ground beneath them. Your silence wasn't empty. It was full of restructuring, full of internal conversations they never heard, full of discipline, full of uncomfortable self-examination. While they were narrating externally, you were reconstructing internally. That's the difference. They mistook visibility for progress. You understood that transformation rarely happens under bright lights. So you stepped into the dark not to hide, to rebuild. There's something profoundly destabilizing about realizing you underestimated someone who never argued back. If you had shouted, they could have dismissed you. If you had lashed out, they could have labeled you emotional. If you had defended yourself endlessly, they could have called you insecure. But you didn't give them anything to grab onto. You removed friction. And when there's no friction, manipulation loses its leverage. You stopped feeding the dynamic. You stopped reacting to projections. You stopped correcting every misinterpretation. And what happens when someone refuses to react the way you expect? You're forced to face your own expectations. That's where the exposure truly happened. Not in a public showdown, not in a dramatic reveal, in the slow realization that you were never who they thought you were. You were simply quieter than they could comprehend. They built an image of you based on your lowest visible moment. They assumed that moment defined you. But you understood something they didn't. Moments are not identities. Struggle is not destiny. Silence is not surrender. They saw you pause and assumed collapse. They didn't consider integration. They didn't consider that maybe you were consolidating lessons. Maybe you were reorganizing priorities. Maybe you were becoming someone they'd never met before. Now they're noticing differences. The way you speak, fewer words, more weight. The way you respond, slower, deliberate. The way you don't respond, intentional. There's no frantic energy anymore, no urgency to prove, no hunger for validation. And that absence of urgency unsettles people who built their confidence on being right about you. Because if they were wrong about you, what else were they wrong about? That's the question echoing now, not loudly, quietly. Internally, they're watching you move forward without referencing the past. That's the part they didn't anticipate. They expected you to circle back, to confront, to reclaim, to announce. Instead, you transcended the need. You outgrew the courtroom entirely. You didn't need to win the argument. You needed to win your alignment. And once alignment is secured, the external noise becomes background. There's something deeply powerful about allowing time to reveal truth without forcing it. Time exposes exaggeration. Time exposes arrogance. Time exposes premature celebration. You didn't have to point fingers. Time did the pointing. You didn't have to gather a jury. Results did the speaking. And here's the subtle beauty of it. You never sought to humiliate anyone. You never intended for anyone to feel foolish. You simply refused to participate in a narrative that wasn't yours. That refusal created space. And in that space, clarity surfaced. Clarity for you first, then, inevitably, for them. Now they're experiencing something unfamiliar. Restraint, they're more careful with their words, more cautious with assumptions, more aware of how quickly certainty can unravel. Not because you retaliated, because you didn't. You modeled something more unsettling than revenge. You modeled patience. Patience is disarming. Patience is destabilizing to ego, because ego thrives on immediate validation. You let validation come from trajectory, not applause. They expected you to crumble under misjudgment. Instead, you used it as insulation. You stopped seeking to be understood by people who never intended to understand. And when someone withdraws from that chase, something shifts in the power dynamic, not dominance. Detachment, you detached from the need to control perception. And once perception no longer controls you, freedom begins. You didn't become louder. You became clearer. You didn't fight for narrative. You built substance. And substance always outlives speculation. There's an interesting tension now. They can't openly admit they misjudged you without confronting their own impulsiveness. But they can't ignore the evidence either. So there's quiet recalibration, quiet humility, quiet observation. The same observation you practiced months ago. Now the roles are reversed, not through force, but through evolution. They're watching you the way you once watched them. But here's the difference. You weren't watching to compete. You were watching to learn. You weren't watching to attack. You were watching to understand. And that understanding made you dangerous in one way only. Dangerous to illusions. You didn't destroy anyone. You dismantled false perception. You didn't orchestrate exposure. You allowed projection to overextend itself. When someone speaks too confidently about another person's limits, they reveal their own, and you let them. Because correcting people too early interrupts the lesson. You allowed the full arc to play out. And now the arc is complete. But you're not stopping. That's the part they're still trying to process. You're not pausing to savor vindication. You're not looking back for acknowledgement. You're moving forward. Always forward. Because this was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to yourself that you didn't need to defend your growth, that you didn't need to collapse under misunderstanding, that you could withstand being underestimated without scrambling to fix it. That's composure. That's discipline. That's power over your own reactions. And that kind of self-mastery doesn't make noise. It radiates stability. They're learning now what you learned earlier. Judgment without full understanding is fragile. Certainty without patience is dangerous. Assumptions without evidence are temporary. You didn't expose anyone. You exposed the fragility of premature conclusions. You didn't win by overpowering. You won by outlasting. And as you continue building steady, intentional, unbothered, the narrative continues adjusting around you. No dramatic climax. No final speech. No triumphant monologue. Just momentum. Quiet momentum. And that momentum is still expanding. Because the story they thought ended was only the intermission. And you're still walking.